Hello, everyone. Joining us today on the Sustainability Sisters is Heeta Lakhani, a dynamic leader and change maker in the field of sustainability and climate action. She has worn many hats from founding the Climate Act Initiative and the Youth Negotiators Academy, and she has driven impactful youth partnerships at organizations like March for Science. Also, a hands on advocate for change, working on everything from eco audits to gender inclusive climate policies. We're thrilled to have Heeta here with us. Now, let's hear a little bit from her on climate action and sustainability. And today we have Heeta Lakhani with us. So, Heeta, first off, I would want to ask you how your journey has been, such that you have landed up in sustainability and climate action. And with your long list of achievements in youth empowerment, we would like to know what inspired you to begin.
Well, I think for me, I never really thought of this as a career path to start with. But when it started, I mean, as a child, kids are attracted to nature. You like being out in nature, you like to play, So a lot of my childhood, either looked after some injured birds, rescued some animals. Um, and we had a family farm, and I spent a lot of my time growing up in the vacations. I spent, holidays there. But I think one incident that I remember very clearly was I was around 13 and coming home from school in Bombay, and I was passing by Marine Drive. And there was a Marine Drive beautification project. So basically, they were widening the road, they were creating a promenade that we see, the walk path that we see today. Um, and that time, even the side on the sea on Marine Drive was lined with coconut trees in between some of the other trees that you see today. So they were interspersed. And as part of the beautification project, they took out these coconut trees. And it was when that work was ongoing one afternoon. And I think they probably had just taken out a tree and it was lying horizontal on this trailer. They hadn't cut it, they uprooted the entire tree and it was lying horizontal. And you could see its entire root system out. And it's a massive tree, as we all know. The coconut trees are big and tall, and the root system was massive. And that big tall tree was lying horizontal on a trailer instead of vertical, as it should be in the ground. And that image, until today, completely shook me. I could not understand how this was a beautification project when the natural beauty was actually being taken out of the place. So I was in tears, and when I went home, this sort of stayed with me. Uh, I went home crying, and it was, for the next few days, this was all I kept talking about. And it was around that time, I think someone very jokingly was like, you care so much, you should be an environmentalist when you grow up.
Yeah, why
So
not?
that stayed with me. And I had never heard the word environmentalist. It was more as a taunt to a kid going like, oh no, you care so much, you should be an environmentalist. Uh, so it stayed with me. I started asking my parents what it meant. And then I was like, this doesn't sound too bad. So that's what I told people. I was like, I'm going to be an environmentalist, without actually knowing anything about what or how. So that's basically what stayed with me. And then I, of course, did a master's in environmental studies. And then it's been a massive learning journey actually after my master's as well. And it's been a lovely trajectory. But that was the backstory that I think that I remember that changed the course of my thinking.
It's quite cool. We actually have a lot of listeners who do not come from an entirely sustainable background. Like I'm sure Amrita has also done her PhD and she's done an engineering. I've studied geography in my bachelor's and after that disaster management. These are somewhat related to climate studies, but I've seen other diverse backgrounds coming in. Do you have anything to tell them, since your journey started with passion? Maybe you would have some insight.
I think, especially today, I think like all careers at some point come under this big gamut of sustainability. Um, and or a green career, or everything is sort of changing course. So, for example, let's say you're an architect. A lot of the construction now doesn't just have to be because it's cool, but really has to be because there's not much enough option. It has to be what we call green architecture. And of course, there are bonus points when buildings do, when they have certain things in place, if they have certain structures in place, certain kinds of building material, you can always leverage it. You can talk about how it is part of the sustainable or a green building. Um, or as simple as things as, we recycle our water, we're collecting rainwater, we're harvesting it, we're whatever that might be. Um, So I think it's like, so that is one example, but whether you're a lawyer, whether you're an architect, whether, whatever field you might be in, at this point, every sort of field comes under this gamut of sustainability. So um, I think if you're passionate about wanting to make a difference, it doesn't matter what your professional career is. I mean, of course, you could always careers change. You can always make different decisions in life, no matter, what stage of life you're in. That's one side of things. But even otherwise, I think that there is a way to make a difference no matter what you're doing and no matter what your background is and what you've studied. So all you need to know is just have a little bit of passion, be inquisitive, keep asking questions, and I think that's sort of one of the key things to make change.
Yeah, okay. Truly inspiring. I also read your paper published, whatever has been published about your work as in climate in papers, and I'm truly inspired that what you said, that the change should be practical and it should be relatable. Our actions should be relatable. It should not. It should be beyond theories in books, etc. Right. So it was really inspiring for me, because as an environmentalist myself, who have studied the subject and practicing continuously in some form, I also validate my actions. Am I really making a change, or is it just some kind of facade I'm doing? But one thing I want to ask you, Hita, is you started this climate action out of your passion, but how did community accept your actions, and what kind of collaborations initially you received?
So yeah, I mean, the first thing, I mean, when I studied environmental studies, of course, I was going back and forth on deciding what I wanted to do, and I eventually did it in my master's. I was actually going back and forth already in bachelor's whether I wanted to do environment. And that time there were a lot of people saying, "Oh, you're limiting your choices. What if this is something you really don't enjoy? What if this is something that you've thought of?" And sometimes it does happen. What you think of as a kid that you don't necessarily grow up into doing that, which is very normal. Um, so I eventually didn't do a bachelor's in environmental studies. I did a master's in it after I finished my bachelor's because by then I was very sure I knew that I wanted to do environment by the time I'd graduated. Um, so I mean, formally the education came in a little later, but uh, after that, when I finished, I studied in New Delhi. I came back home to Bombay, and I first, I mean, while I was still deciding jobs and applying, wanted to figure out what where I would work. I studied German for the fun of it. So I did that and then I really liked it. I did well in it as well. So I ended up doing one
Yes.
level after the next, and I eventually studied German for almost a year after I did my master's. And my first job was then as a German expert with TCS, and it wasn't really in the field of environment. So after my master's, I took a year studying a language, and then that ended up being my first job. So that was, I mean, completely unplanned. Some friends were applying for, jobs as I mean, they wanted to be translators or they wanted to be language experts, and I applied only because they were applying, so it was fun to do something with, and I ended up getting a job, and I was like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. So I did that for a year, and this was then in 2015 when the COP in Paris was about to happen. So there was a lot of conversation in the media. Prime Minister Modi's first COP that he was going to attend on climate. So the newspapers were all talking about it. And then that's when, I was like, okay, this looks like this is the place to be. Uh, I had no idea, of course, at that point what a COP meant, what even went on at a COP. So I started looking online and I was like, if this is was something I was just more curious about more than anything. But I was very curious and I was like, okay, how does one register for this? How can I, attend if I wanted to? And of course, I didn't find any registration link. And now I laugh at myself because now I know how it works. So I didn't find anything. So I started writing to people saying like, "Hi, I can't find a registration link. Can you guide me to the right website? I don't know if I'm doing the right thing." Um, so eventually that one thing led to another and I was volunteering somewhere and that sort of,
But
anyway, I met
do
that led
tell
to.
us, how do you get an invite for COP? Because I'm sure people are dying to know. Okay, and we have done this too. We've been there.
Yeah. I mean, you need to go as a part of a delegation for an organization that is accredited. Basically, that's registered with the UNFCCC, which is the UN climate change body. So there's no like you can't sign up anywhere and register to attend like any other conference.
Yeah, please call.
Uh,
Yeah, it's not it's not Cannes Film Festival that influencers can go. You need to be accredited. Yeah. Recently, when one of my friend was going, and I looked like how people go and who gets an invite. Something
Yeah.
like that. Felt really nice to know that, Geeta. Thanks for sharing. And what was the reaction of youth when you try to advocate, teach, give them exposure toward climate change, etc.?
So when I started actually back in, I think, late 2017 with workshops in India specifically on climate education, it started mainly because by then I attended a few UN climate change negotiation sessions. I was understanding how the process worked. And each time I went, I felt like I learned something new. So I said, this is a world of itself. And me having done a master's in the field, I felt like I walked into complete unknown territory. I started entirely from scratch when I went in there. My first COP, I was in Paris. I was completely lost. I mean, physically, but also just like on what thematically on what was happening there. Um, I was there for 1 week. I attended the conference of youth before that, which was a lovely experience. But the COP in itself, I was like, this is great, but I mean, yeah, I have no clue what happens here. I don't think I'm coming back.
Bye.
Without knowing that we were actually negotiating one of the world's biggest and most important treaties at that point, which was then in the second week, which was finalized, which was the Paris Agreement.
Imagine.
So, yeah, um, a lot of it that I learned on the go over the next few years, and it was one through community, through other young people, through mentors, friends, peers who I then met and made in this space and sort of built over the years. And that practical experience really helped me because there's nowhere else that anyone teaches you about a COP anywhere.
Yeah.
Now there are some explainers and there are some, I know of organizations and I do a lot of COP trainings myself as well, but at least I wasn't aware of any at that point. So basically, I mean, the biggest thing that kept coming back to me year on year, the more I understood the process and how it worked was that, if someone who has been here now a few times, it took me so much time to understand, just navigate the space, forget being good at it, but navigating it and being able to sit in the rooms, being able to, understand what was going on and having a proper academic degree. I mean, I can't imagine people who have no idea about that. And then even knowing that there's a space like a COP, and now of course the COP is, I mean, a lot more people know about it. Everyone's talking about it. All media houses are talking about it, which is a good thing. But at that point, it was still very select few. Other than Paris, I mean, the next couple of COPs were very small, and you wouldn't really hear about it in mainstream media as well. So that's what it started for me. I basically wanted to simplify the world of the UN for children in India, so that they would then want to be a part of it in, abroad. I mean, that's what I wanted to do. But then when I started doing that, I realized that the climate education was still very, very nascent. People don't understand the word climate change now, and it's only a matter of like about 6 or 8 years ago what I'm talking about. But in that time, also people are now talking about climate change a lot more. Like at least the terminology is used, even if the understanding might not be holistic. People know the word. At that point, people knew global warming. Some people knew climate change, but not everybody. Um, so that sort of automatically took a course of becoming a climate education training rather than being a UN training. Because in order to understand what happened there, I first had to explain climate change. So that's how it started for me. And it then took various shapes. So each time I did a workshop, I tweaked from it, I learned from it, and then sort of did another one. And I started first with my school, went back to because that was the easiest. You go back to your school and, as an ex-student, they really can't say much to you. So they're like, okay, fine, you have 1 hour with these two classes, you do what you want. So it started as one-off sessions like this, and eventually sort of grew bit by bit. It was a passion project for the longest time, and about 2.5 years ago or 2 years ago, something like this, was when I formally set it up as an NGO, which is now the Climate Initiative. So that has been sort of a very organic journey. When I started, I never really thought, oh, this is going to be an NGO. I'm going to be doing climate education for the rest of my life, or or some version of that in some form. And of course, now we're trying to fill different gaps. It's focusing on climate leadership building, along with education and capacity building. So that's one side of it. And then there was another whole trajectory eventually, which we can talk about, which is basically in the negotiations itself and
Okay.
building capacity to be part of that process.
So you are You'll be teaching youth about how to negotiate for climate action.
Yeah, so there's another organization that I co-founded about 2.5 years ago, same in 2022, around the same time,
Right.
which is the Youth Negotiators Academy. And this, of course, stemmed out of personal experiences. And I mean, as they both did, but this one was specifically focused on the UN negotiations. And this was after I finished my mandate leading the youth constituency, as you know, which is called Yango. So it's basically a mechanism of engagement a mechanism for engaging young people in the UN climate change space. Um,
We recently had another conversation with someone else who was at Yango, Margaret Imprime, and she was
yeah.
talking about the same issues, right? Because a negotiation is such a skill that is required, and usually the youth do not know how to speak this language. So even if they know about climate, they know how to organize themselves, and they're passionate about a subject. To explain themselves to the people or persons who are, say, in power, political power, or in a position to help might be a very difficult situation. And this space that you are filling through your academy, this is a great story to have. I mean, congratulations on being able to build this.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think anyone in the outside world, young people, of course, but even adults, I mean, the world of the UN and the negotiations and the language, the technicalities, um, I think anyone externally, it's very hard for them to know what or how it functions. If you happen to sit through a negotiation session, um, what they're basically doing is on the screen there is text and they're going word by word, line by line into every single word in the text. And at some point they will say, this is what we're okay with, this is what we choose to bracket something and we want to go back. And you will talk about a should and a shall and a will and a would and the littlest of things to then of course much more bigger language. Um, so if you have no idea what you're walking into, one, it can first be very boring because it is slow and it takes time. But two, also, I mean, while it's all in English, at the same time, there is a lot of technicalities to it. And you'll just wonder, like, why is it taking so long? And why are we talking about whether it is this and that, or whether it is this, or whatever that might be, or parties shall, follow blah, 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 or parties should, or parties may. And all of sometimes it's these very small details which we get stuck in the negotiations. So I remember the first few times when I was sitting in the rooms and I was like, this is madness. Like, I cannot understand why every little word like this, like, why, how does it matter? Just put should or shall and just move on. But each of them has a legal implication. Each of them strengthens or weakens the text. Each of them has a certain kind of meaning and methodology, what it would mean, or sort of how it would then play out, how would it then sort of affect over the next few years, over the accountability, over implementation, whatever the relevance is. One is just understanding that.
Yeah.
And then two is also like, how do you actually get, I mean, youth to be in those spaces, right? When I was global focal point of Yango, of course, we had the Conference of Youth, we had the outcomes from the Global Youth Statement, as we've had for the last so many years. But um, in order to actually bring these outcomes in the text in some form, to sort of build that link, we did a lot of advocacy. We did a lot of running from country office to country office, finding the right countries that will support us, that will, be willing to champion the language of young people. And of course, at the end of it, the small win was the sort of cover decision or the sort of outcome that came out of COP26 in 2021, um, which had a sort of language on youth. And it's these small sort of wins in terms of these words in the text, which then matters to us as well. But imagine how easier if it would be if each of these countries actually had a youth delegate. They actually had young negotiators who were part of the team already, who in some form were already sort of connected to the youth movement outside and were connected to each other. And then we didn't have to do all of this lobbying. It would just be so much easier if all of these demands were known beforehand.
And
If
there
these
was like
connections
a
were, they could
designated
have,
stock, yeah,
yeah, and
reach.
they could have brought these things into their countries, then we would not have to fight from one country to another. So that's basically what we wanted to overcome. And we said, we don't see anyone doing this, so we're going to create it ourselves. So that's basically what happened. And that's what we did. Basically, the Youth Negotiators Academy works with countries around the world. We sign agreements with countries. So we get a country on board. And then the country nominates young people to us between the ages of 18 to 35, who we train, which means that in the agreement that they sign, they have agreed that this young person will be a part of their national delegation. They will have a negotiation mandate. So those sort of first lines of, I mean, that's one of the basic things which they agree to. And then, of course, once they're trained, then they're part of the national delegations at COP. Some of them some of them
So
we don't.
these young people who trains with your academy, are they professional negotiators, or they have to have some kind of scientific background? I mean, like, to be able to negotiate. Is the delegation who negotiates is separate from people who talk science at UN? This is coming from like a person who, yeah, like no experience
Yeah.
of.
Official national delegation for a country is generally civil servants, so basically government members.
Right.
They may or may not be like trained negotiators. Some countries might have like negotiation training. Some of them just learn on the job. Most of them learn on the job. I used to manage all of our country relations and lead that for Youth Negotiators Academy. And um, I've had heads of delegations tell me saying, I wish we had this training when I first went into my first COP, whatever it is, 10 years, 15 years ago. Because very few people actually get official training on the UN climate change process and how to negotiate. So that's basically what we did. It is an intense training. It's about 5 or 6 months. So it covers the history of the UN to how to negotiate to thematic topics to language to a bunch of other things. So it's quite intensive. It needs a lot of commitment. And then the outcome is that the outcome is pretty rewarding, but it's also a big responsibility because you're then at the end of the year, at the end of the day, you're part of your national delegation. You're part of your country's team, sitting at the UN, representing your country and its interests. So it is. I mean, it does require you to then be able to have the right kind of technical knowledge, and I think we also stress a lot on the importance of really knowing and sort of training them well enough. And there are, of course, layers. We have a fundamental training and then an advanced training. But there is so of course, the first year is not as, I mean, you learn the basics, but the advanced training gets into details of negotiations, things like this in the second year. But one of the biggest reasons was that we've had lots of people, I mean, always people tell us saying, youth are brilliant, you have so much energy, advocate outside, you should, we need a lot of that on the streets, but this is very technical, don't come in the rooms here. This is for like people with expertise. So that's basically the notion that we're trying to break, saying that young people do have the expertise if they're trained. And sometimes some of our negotiators actually have more expertise than some of the other senior negotiators because they've not had any training. And they've somehow had to figure some things on the go. So they may or may not know some things. But some of our negotiators know, like, oh no, but this is not what it means. And this is how we should do things. So one was just to sort of say that, if you are putting a young person on the table, they need to know their job. Because then, if not, it feeds into the mindset going like, youth are brilliant, but again, look, this person is here, but they don't know what they're doing. You might as well be out of the room advocating. Don't come in here. This is technical stuff. So they need to have the capacity to be able to sit and talk face to face and not feel like I'm not a good fit here. So that's basically a lot of like a focus in the program as well.
So I know it's mind-numbing when someone says you're too young to speak in this room, especially because most of the people working today in climate action, even in corporate, say, are the youth, because these jobs attract a lot more youth than they do other people, right? But then you have been going to COP since 2015, and now it's almost a decade since 2015. How would you say the negotiations have at COP have evolved, or have they at all? What's your take on it? Give us the insider's view.
Um, well, I think negotiations, I mean, there are a few things that have changed. One is the sheer volume and the number of people that come to a COP.
Yeah.
Paris at that point was one of the biggest COPs, and that was about 30,000 people. And now the COP in Dubai in so last year in 20, what year are we in? 2023, COP 28. So COP 28 had 100,000 people. COP 29 had over 70,000 people. in a small town, I mean, small town, but in like much smaller Baku compared to Dubai. And it is, of course, smaller than what Paris was. Um, and Paris itself had 30,000 people. So just the volume of sort of people coming to COP, one is that. And with that, of course, the attention that, people give and people, I mean, like media, I mean, all sorts of things, right? So with more people attending, more people are talking about it. Social media is so much more accessible. I mean, 2015 also had social media, but it's not that long ago. But it's still just the amount of information. I mean, and now it's so much easier. You can be in a room, you can put an Instagram story, take a picture of someone and go like, this is what it is. And it's reached a few hundred people at least. So I think one, just accessibility of information, knowing what's going on. I mean, not necessarily knowing like all of the details in the negotiations, but at least knowing that this is happening. That has changed massively. And with that, of course, there are more eyes and a lot more media are talking about it, a lot more, youth groups are there, but also others. Like there are so many more women groups, indigenous peoples, all of these things that have sort of become more active. Um, so in that sense, and then of course people are now, I mean, they've always been, but they're also now asking more and more for more accountability, for more representation. So I think all of that is important. I think what we need to be very careful about is what we really mean by representation. Is representation just bringing a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, or an indigenous young Black woman, let's say, or whatever that might be, to a COP? I mean, and yes, that is representation in one form. Um, but representation also really means that we need those views and voices to be in the rooms, which mean that we need to have those people in the negotiating tables, not just at the COP. And there is a difference. Going to a COP is not going to give you access into the negotiation tables. That is for national delegations only. It is a country-driven, it's a party-driven process, as we call it. It's a national process. It's an intergovernmental process. So to be part of the decision, I mean, you can sit in the rooms, you can observe the negotiations, but to be part of decision making, you need to be in the national delegations. And that is where we need representation. That is where we need the most vulnerable voices coming in. That is where we need those people to be champions of the most vulnerable countries, or the most vulnerable populations in society. So, I mean, representation, one thing is, yes, I've brought in so many young people to COP, or so many, I mean, I'm just saying young people because I work with young people, but so many, diversities to COP. But another big part of representation is like what is changing in those rooms. And in those rooms, changing very, very, I mean, it is changing. A lot of the negotiators now are actually young, not just because of our program. I mean, that's one part of it, but in general, because there's a new crop, right? I mean, they're always young people. So that's, I mean, it's just going to be the case. A lot more negotiators are now under the age of 35. There are so many more women negotiators that you see now than when you see, earlier. So, I mean, some things are just gradual changes. There is more access, like there are more women who are, knowing about this. There are more women in different workforces. There are more. So it like some things are just, they're going to change regardless because that's how the world is evolving. But some things are really like, how do we want it to change? And I think that bit is a little slow. But yeah, I mean, otherwise the negotiation process is quite technical. The process has been the same for decades. And it is a slow process. It takes forever. And which is why sometimes you feel like, nothing is moving. Well, it is moving, but it's moving in a very different way, in a very different pace. And milestones and victories and sort of are looked at in a different way than we look at it outside. So there are different ways of how sort of celebrations are calculated in that sense.
Talking about access, Hita, I want to know what is the most common way or medium through which people know about your work and your NGO?
I think a little bit now, one of the ways is Instagram, because I think that's where I'm most active in terms of like for the external world. But otherwise, I think Instagram, LinkedIn, and then we have a website, but we're redoing the website. So hopefully, like shortly, that'll be slightly more better and newer than what we have right now. So those are like some ways of knowing. And then, of course, we have a cohort of climate leadership program that we're running. So the cohort is doing different work and they're sort of coming to the end of the program in a couple of months. So they're all going into an implementation phase of the program, which means that they're either sort of building projects of their own, and we'll see over the next couple of months how that looks like, or doing different things. So yeah, I mean there are different ways of then either interacting with the cohort or social media.
Good
So,
to know that there is a community which is accepting new climate leaders in the country. It's nice to know that
Yeah.
because there are multiple actions and duplicity of them causes so much confusion. I mean, like, yeah, same kind of work at different places by different people. So, yeah, right. Thank you.
to we'll close this conversation soon, but we need something else from you, Hita. What are some recent movies you've watched, or books you've read, or journals or articles that have been of a special interest to you, but somewhat related to sustainability and climate action?
I mean, one book that I've just started reading, only a week or so ago is, actually I have it right next to me. This is by Ramchandra Guha, which is, well, it says Speaking with Nature, The Origins of Indian Environmentalism. So I'm just at the start of it. Actually, I haven't just sort of, it's only been a week or so that I've started reading it. Yeah, so and this is a relatively new book by Ramchandra Guha. And I mean, so far it's very interesting. I've been wanting to know more about just environmentalism in India, and a lot of my focus since a few months has been focusing on India, on of course, building work in India, but it's also just been a general curiosity of like wanting to know more about and contributing more in country. So I think this is what I'm looking forward to actually going through. What I've read so far is very interesting. And it starts with, I mean, he's documented a few different people and their work. And the first one is of Rabindranath Tagore, and that's what I'm reading right now. Uh, yeah, and otherwise, I mean, I think I'm reading another at the same time, another fiction, which I got recently from Baku, uh,
Oh,
which was by a local author. It's a children's book, but it was a local author from Baku, and um, it talks about stories during the World War and how sort of life was in Baku and through a children's point of view. And it's fiction, but it's also very interesting to see life and sort of just get bits and pieces of
and
that through the book and the author. So yeah.
Baku has had quite the history too. We'll discuss it sometime later.
Yeah.
Also, what is one
Yeah.
place that you like to travel to? This does not necessarily have to do with sustainability at all. This is just for us. One place that you love to travel to. And you've been across the world, we know that, but there must be that one place.
Um, I think this is a very hard question.
Is it?
I don't know. One place that I'd keep wanting to go back to, I mean, as a country, it's Germany. It's
Oh,
also probably because I speak the language and I have like an affinity to it now. And I have family friends and just friends, like German friends. Um, but I think a lot of it, I mean, there are just so many places in India where it would just, I mean, a lot take me into a forest or put me next to a river. And it doesn't matter where it is. I think those are some of the places that I will keep going back to. I spent the last few months in Canada, and every moment I got free, I was either trying to, if I was in Vancouver, I was going by the beach. If I was, somewhere else, trying to go for a hike or going to a lake with a friend. So yeah, and Canada did like offer a lot of these natural places. So that was actually very nice as well.
so nice to hear. It has been great having you, Hida. Thank you for coming. And do you have any last words on our channel right now for our listeners?
Well, I think one of the things is that, we need, and this is a quote that, we've read multiple times, like we need everyone to do whatever little bit that you can to make a difference. Because imagine if there are thousands of us doing small things, it's already going to mean, so many different, like the scale of that is going to just blow up massively. So I think one is um, just pick something that you're passionate about, something that you care deeply about in the environment space, and just see what you can do for that. And I think this is, I mean, there was a movie I'd seen recently, which was at the All Living Things Environmental Film Festival. And I think one thing that came out of that movie was that the movie was The Giants, and it was about a person's sort of journey in Australia and how he's sort of went from activism to being in parliament and things like this. But anyway, one thing that came out from there that stuck with me was that how he said that this struggle was not just his struggle, but it was, because he said, when I was fighting, I was actually fighting for um, the trees and for the sort of nature that could not speak, and he felt that it was it was a fight much larger than just for your own sort of need and well-being or whatever that might be. And I think that was very beautiful, because a lot of this is, I mean, this is so much larger than each of us, but it still needs each of us to be a part of it. And I think this is the sort of beauty of it. If we can all do whatever that might be, I think that sort of, whatever that, like, no matter how big or small that imprint is, it's definitely leaving an imprint on the planet.
That was beautiful. Thank you. And with
Truly
that,
very nice.
we're signing off. Like, share, and subscribe.